Hi everyone, I'm Evelyn Hemphill. I'm also known as Evelyn the Advocate. I'm a domestic violence survivor, domestic violence advocate, and activist. I'm from South Carolina. I'm wearing my Stop the Domestic Violence t-shirt from Deal to Heal merchandise in South Carolina. And we have attorney Christine Miller here with us. It's nice to have the opportunity to speak with you. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Christine Miller. I am in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm a former divorce attorney. I practiced family law for nearly a decade. And I am an advocate for changing, reforming, or abolishing family court. The way we conduct family court is not working. Your story is an inspiration. Now, certainly, I was never your attorney. I'm not licensed there. But what
Correct.
happens in domestic violence cases, custody cases, divorce cases throughout this country in family court is truly a tragedy, and something needs to be done. Family court is not working the way that it was intended to work.
I certainly agree with that. We're going to dive into a few questions if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Being that you're experienced and you've worked in the courtroom and faced a lot of these situations, how what's your opinion on when people find themselves in abusive relationships? What do you think happens when they have to go to court, when marriage and children are involved?
I think generally there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the cycle of domestic violence and how long the process goes on. I mean, the true understanding of a trauma bond and the fact that there can be highs and lows. I mean, the person that is quote unquote abusive doesn't present like that immediately, right? If that were the case, no one would enter a relationship with that person. No one would enter a business partnership with that person. They are able to mask it. And that is really how you know that you're dealing with a person that is abusive. If they are able to conduct themselves in certain settings in a way that doesn't show this abuse or this talking down to or this sort of behavior, then they can control it. And that is the key sign of being abusive, in my opinion.
That's a great point. So, how has the face of domestic violence changed over the years in your experience? What's happening now and what was happening before?
So I started my career as a public defender. I actually went to law school in Boston and worked at the prosecutor's office. I clerked with the judge, and then I worked at the public defender's office, and that was really my passion. So when I first came back, I was doing criminal defense work and juvenile public defense. And certainly you saw domestic violence, family trauma in the court system. And this is 15 years ago. And this is in a very different location than I am now. But I do think there is more awareness socially with domestic violence. Like if you talk about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, and certainly in no way, shape, or form am I do I have any medical training? But the key that you see with these sorts of relationships are the patterns. And the patterns, it is, the same play, different actors. But I do think with the creation of family court, there is almost a lack of understanding. I felt like a better way to put it would be my criminal judges that I used to practice in front of had a better understanding of domestic violence. And I'll give you a perfect example. We used to, as public defenders, have to watch the DV docket. And I was in a county that did not have a family court. And there was a dad that had cut the child's hair, and no, I'm sorry, there was a mom that had cut the child's hair and dad got mad, so he cut mom's hair to punish her. And this judge was like, oh my goodness. And after court, he pulled me aside and was like, Christine, that is one of the most dangerous indicators for domestic violence. Like, that is such a betrayal of your bodily autonomy. That is not how you conduct yourself. And this is 15 years ago in a small town, and this is a male judge. And I think it's important to bring that up, and I'll explain why in just a second. But he had much more of an understanding of domestic violence than a lot of the judges do in family court. Another fundamental problem, you talk about the change in demographics with, you know, domestic violence, but I do want to talk a little bit about the change in demographics with judges.
Okay.
So we have a significant amount of female judges, and obviously, you know, I am pro female. I know you are empowerment, but it's a shocking to me how many female judges do not have an understanding of the cycle of domestic violence. And sometimes I almost think it could be the notion like, oh my gosh, if this is how it actually works, then it could happen to me. But I do think that that's one of the problems that we have as well is there is a lack of understanding. You know, people want female judges are elected, right? They almost win all elections, and in Kentucky we elect judges. But there is a lack of understanding amongst the female population that this can happen to them. Really, I think women want to believe that could never happen to me. I would never find myself in that circumstance. And I think all too often it happens to a great percentage of women.
This can happen to anybody, male, female, anyone. Domestic violence does not discriminate.
100%. Absolutely. I do think that when males are victims of domestic violence, it's often overlooked in court as well. And I think there's the notion that, again, like you said at the beginning, it goes back to this pattern of behavior and this trauma bond and this cycle that is just fundamentally misunderstood at how much that breaks a person down. No one ever thinks they're going to get to that low of a point when the abuse starts and it escalates significantly. Like your
That,
story.
that's right. And it destroys communities. It really does. If you don't have support and you're not strong enough to handle a situation like this, it's very detrimental to your life and the community because taxpayers, this falls back on society. The
Absolutely. It's a great
results of
example.
domestic violence.
100%. And the cycle that it perpetuates and continues. And we have to think about grown adults, male or female, that are in these trauma bonds and the victims of abusive relationships. And that in and of itself is traumatic and hard enough. But when you talk about just the mental capacity of a child that gets involved in this kind of world, it is so much more difficult. They are so easy to manipulate. They don't have a frame of reference. They are discovering their self identity, their sense of self. And if they grow up in a home with domestic violence, they are so easy. The abuser is often able in family court to manipulate the children to skew the story and spin the narrative. That's been my experience.
That's been my experience too. So in South Carolina, where I'm from, South Carolina is a state that's ranked number 6 in the nation for domestic violence. And that's very sad, in my opinion, because we are not a very large state. So, what have you found in the area where you've practiced law in Kentucky?
I think the demographics of Kentucky and South Carolina are pretty similar. I do think that there is something to be said about the South in the sense of talking about domestic violence. It was discussed very differently when I was in school in Boston. And there was a different understanding, but I do think, I was raised in a certain kind of way, and my grandmothers in particular were extraordinarily strong women. But there still is in the South, in my opinion, this notion that as women in particular, you don't talk about certain things, and we're not prepared for certain things. And we really, at least in my experience growing up, you're not prepared for the fact that, certainly, like we talked about, abusers present themselves as good people. They are pillars of the community many times. And so it's really hard to understand that perhaps, the local doctor or the local preacher, and this is not everyone, but right, but it happens where the pillar of the community could be the perpetrator. And it's very hard, I think, with Southern values, in my experience, to see that as well as you can see that in the North, because we give so much more deference in the South to older people and people of statute, in my opinion.
That's correct. And even when I came out in my situation, I was not believed. Everybody just thought that I was making up a story on my second abuser. I was abused as a teenager in a different relationship. And then when I became married, I was abused again, but people just did not believe me.
Well, I think there's two things that you touch on there that are important to talk about. And one is the fact that if you have been in an abusive relationship, it's my understanding that it's extraordinarily high that you will be in another abusive
Yeah.
relationship. And I think there's a fundamental, again, misunderstanding of how that works, it's cyclical, right? It's not like the first date, there is any sort of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. Not at all. Oftentimes, what I have seen in doing divorces is that it may not happen until the marriage. It may not happen until the pregnancy. I think studies show that those are pregnancy for a woman is the most dangerous time of her life. And we have known that for many, many years. But it's
Yes.
almost as though with an abusive person that's truly abusive, and especially when you're talking about emotional abuse, a lot of times there'll be that flip that switches. And studies show, it's my understanding, that that happens often when you get to like a finish line, like a marriage or a pregnancy. And especially when it comes to pregnancy, abusive people tend to be very self centered and very needy, and don't understand that when a child is involved, obviously an infant or a child is always going to be put before an adult, especially from a caregiver role, whether it be mom or dad. And
That's
so that
correct.
triggers the beginning of the escalation. And people also don't understand the first true, well, I want to be careful because I don't want to be disrespectful to anyone, but the first true escalation, or the first more serious escalation where that gut feeling is like, I got to get out of here, it goes downhill from there very quickly in what I've seen in my experience as an attorney.
So when people go to family court, it's kind of difficult to get abuse actually documented, in my opinion, in the South. If you are a certain person or you've presented a certain image, it can be happening, but it's very hard to get it documented for it to help you in court. So you just mentioned that most abusers present themselves as being nice, but tell us how these abusers are winning against domestic violence victims in court.
So victims of domestic violence, often, like we talked about with trauma bonds, they present a certain kind of way. And it's almost as though, you push and you push and you push and you push and a person breaks. And I've talked about this ad nauseum, but I do think family court in particular is extraordinarily, quote unquote, crazy making. It makes you crazy because you think, okay, finally, enough is enough. I've had enough. I'm going to talk about what's happened. I'm going to go to court, and there's going to be this savior. And when in fact it's the exact opposite. And you have to realize people that are typically victims of domestic violence are, one, enablers. And they are protecting their abuser often,
Yeah.
when the reality is the abuser may be, quote unquote, like you said, documenting from the beginning. I think no one understands appropriately reactive abuse. That is very, very real. There are new studies, from my understanding, coming out, with, like I said, there's so much more understanding about narcissistic personality disorders and what actually happens to a victim and how that can actually change your brain chemistry. But, oftentimes when you go and you've hit a breaking point, maybe you snapped in response to some of the emotional abuse or the physical abuse that's been going on for so many years. And as the victim, you never thought to record that, right? You never thought, hey, I'll record everything that's been happening. But your abuser is aware when you get to your breaking point, and they may record you reacting. And so you go to court and a judge doesn't understand this. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And they will, they call it the custody flip if children are involved, or the flip where it's like, no, 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 actually, you're the abuser. And it's very hard to ascertain. Also, as attorneys, we aren't trained in law school to assess and have the tools necessary to really ascertain these kind of situations, which I think again goes to the fundamental problem of family court. You have all of these third parties that are appointed custodial evaluators and parenting coordinators, guardian ad litems, friend of the court. We are attorneys. When I was a public defender, I mean, certainly I care about my clients. I want my clients to succeed. I want to get a good legal outcome, but the legal analysis of a situation is extraordinarily different than the therapeutic analysis of a situation, which I believe is why I do believe family court was created with well-intentioned, with the best of intentions. But as another problem with attorneys is we think, some of us generally think we may know everything and we may just understand everything in a quick setting, but that is not the reality. I mean, certainly I think therapists should be ascertaining these, whether or not abuse is occurring and things of that nature, much more than someone with a Juris Doctorate.
I agree with that. Being a domestic violence survivor, I've been misunderstood and misrepresented so many times. How is this negatively impacting the ability to fight cases when you have to go in court and fight against your abuser, when your emotions are kind of all over the place?
There are so many caveats to that. I mean, one, the monetary expense is extraordinary for
Yes.
litigation, in and of itself. The emotional turmoil of, like, even when you just get an email from your attorney, or if you're pro se, from the opposing party's attorney, that in and of itself is triggering.
Right.
I do think it's important to document everything, and I know that's difficult. And also, gray rocking is a really great strategy as far as like not the victim not reacting. But the important thing about family court is proving patterns. It's not one time saying stuff. It is proving the pattern that the abuser is trying to control every situation. Again, we're starting to understand more about coercive control. And when I say we, I mean the courts in general. But I don't think that is something that people realize. Like, it may be you make a doctor's appointment for your child and the other parent didn't have a say so. So they may move every doctor's appointment. That is a control thing. It happens one time. It's like, well, whatever. You had work or you had an event, you change one doctor's appointment. But if the child has 10 different, the children have 10 different doctor's appointments in one calendar year and one parent is always changing the appointment, that is a red flag to judges, and that they can understand because that's a pattern. And so documenting these patterns are so important, and trying to maintain, I mean, it's the thing about codependency, which is almost always present in abusive relationships, is taking care of the victim has to take care of themselves first and foremost, which is much easier said than done, and try to take the emotion out of it, which again is
That's
also
right.
much easier said than done. Lawyers in general are not, when it comes to the law, not emotional people. And I think that's where, and it's there for a reason, right? When you're doing criminal, like for example, criminal defense work, there has to be some capacity. The law is what the law is, and there has to be some capacity to remove emotions. Or if you look at a judge and you have to decide whether or not to suppress some statements in a really high profile sex case or a murder case, suppressing that evidence could have catastrophic emotional effects, but the law is the law. And I don't think that same principle is applying in family court.
That's right. It's just criminal court and family court I found out are two different things. It's two different processes. I've been on each side.
Yes, and family court is the only court that I can think of that there are so many individuals that stand to make money based on more conflict.
Yes.
Like there is not a public defender or a criminal defense attorney that gets more money based on more court appearances. I mean, standard across this country is flat rates for criminal court. So, if you get it taken care of in one appearance, it's X. If you have to go to court 20 times, it's X. Now, there may be jury trial fees, which is reasonable. Like you could bifurcate. But when it comes to family court, billable hours for attorneys, billable hours for parenting coordinators, billable hours for custodial evaluators, billable hours for the children's attorney. And there are so many people that stand to profit off of the conflict that, it's a really precarious and quite frankly dangerous situation for people to be in. Because
It really is.
the ability to exploit is there are so many people that have the ability to exploit, right? You may have the best lawyers on both sides, but you have a parenting coordinator that likes the conflict. The only person that's not making more money based on the conflict is the judge.
Yeah.
Yet the judge has to run for office, and all the people that they're appointing, the more money that they make, they can contribute to the judicial campaign. They can support a judge. It's quite frankly dangerous. That doesn't happen in criminal court, and it doesn't happen in civil court in the same capacity because there are emotions involved, obviously, when you talk about any sort of legal thing. That being said, not the emotions for a breach of contract as it is for custody of your children, for crying out loud. It's a dramatically different emotional toll that it takes on the parties. And in domestic violence and in marriage, that's the person you chose to, one, have children with, or take a vow to till death do you part. And that is a whole nother level of emotional that is just, it's hard to understand because the person that you chose to have children with, create a family with, now becomes your enemy in a way.
Yeah, that's true. I found myself like covering in the past, like not wanting people to know. I was kind of like protecting my former abusers, and I don't understand why I was doing that. But as you mentioned earlier, I was kind of enabling them. I figured that out through therapy, and I will never, ever do that again because as a victim, I'm the one that's paying the dear price for everything because it's being made to look like I'm the bad person and I was the aggressor, but I wasn't.
I mean, victims of domestic violence and emotional abuse are some of the most loyal human beings I have ever met in my life. They are ride or die until they hit that breaking point, until it escalates. And that's the dichotomy that is not understood. Because if their abuser were as loyal to them, I mean, obviously they wouldn't be in an abusive relationship, but that is what the victim is seeking, is that same level of loyalty. And that just goes back into the drama triangle and the cyclical aspect of these sorts of, trauma bonds and abuse. And people don't talk about the toll that emotional abuse takes. I mean, it is almost, I mean, it's my understanding that some studies show that it almost is more debilitating. Now, obviously, physical
Oh,
violence can
yes.
cause, serious things, and that is not something to be taken lightly. But emotional abuse affects your brain and the way you think, the way you react to things. And it's very crazy making because the person just thinks, if I do this, this won't happen, or maybe I am not good, or maybe I am not enough. Which just keeps the ball rolling and gives the abuser more power.
That's right. So, what are some ways, in your opinion, do you think our legal system nationally can improve, to help support victims of domestic violence? What we obviously we need more education, but what else do you think?
I think the bigger picture, I really think we need jury trials, even if they're just 6-person jury trials, because as domestic violence is horrific. Some of the worst, scariest people I've ever met were perpetrators of domestic violence. That being said, unfortunately, there are people that utilize the system and fabricate domestic violence. And that in and of itself is also horrific. But I do think juries, I mean, we use that in criminal court. And of course, no system is going to be perfect. But I do think that regular citizens, regular people can ascertain these things with life experience much better than someone wearing a black robe. And I do think they do Texas trial. I mean, in Texas, they do jury trials for some family court cases, but I think family court in particular doesn't have any sort of checks and balances in the same way that other courts do.
Exactly. I don't know if any really checks and balances they have, because it takes you many years to find out what actually has happened to you in family court because you don't have a legal background. It's like unraveling a ball of rubber bands or something. That's how I compare my situation. When it's happening, you don't understand it. But some years later, if you're lucky, you'll be able to find out what happened.
Absolutely. I haven't been practicing in family court in almost 2 years, with a very few exceptions. But the reason I started speaking out was, there were several issues, but I couldn't go anywhere in the community of Louisville without hearing the horror stories. And they're so they're so crazy almost that people don't believe them. Like their friends and family don't believe them. There's no way a judge ordered that. There's no way this happened. There's no way that happened. And I want people to know, and if this is the one thing that you could take away, is that you aren't crazy. You aren't crazy. The system is. These things are happening. It's really happening. They're getting it wrong more than they're getting it right. And the system itself is continuing the abuse and the gaslighting of these victims. It is not you, it is the system. And I mean that generally speaking. And I really, really would beg family members and friends that have someone that they know or coworkers that are going through this experience, just listen. And it could happen to you. People think it could never happen to them, and you are more likely to touch family court than you ever are to touch civil or criminal court. I mean, if you are married, if you have children, if you ever take care of any child of a family member, I mean, it is a epidemic. I mean, quite frankly, family court is a scary, scary place.
It really is. In your opinion, what do you think the consequences will be if we do not see some changes as far as in our legal processes as far as family court goes? And when it comes to how they deal with domestic violence cases, what do you foresee happening if changes are not implemented in the way we're doing things wrong right now?
Right. I think the huge issue is going to be the children that come out of family court. You have children that are going to have these quote unquote attorneys that were supposed to be representing their best interest that they've never met, that have spent their college funds, potential college funds on these. They're going to have been placed, potentially with the perpetrator as opposed to the victim. Their lives are going to have been lived under a microscope. They may have been recorded by a parent to try to prove something in court. I think we are creating children without appropriate boundaries, with mental health issues. I am very concerned about the substance abuse rate of children. That is a common problem with people that grow up in high conflict households. But I do think that family court is so new. I mean, in Kentucky, it was started in 1991. We're talking, it's a 30-year-old program. So we're really going to start seeing the children come of age once family court really got the ball rolling in the last 10 or 15 years. And obviously the victims and the people that have gone through it, I mean, go bankrupt, they lose their jobs, they have medical issues. But fundamentally, what we are doing to children involved in family court is terrifying.
Very sad, but true. I want to take a moment to thank you. And I also want to take a moment just to talk about this domestic violence organization that I volunteer with. It's called Catapult Outreach. We work throughout North Carolina and South Carolina. We help domestic victims of domestic violence that are women and children. The executive director of that organization is Sherry T. Cribb. So we're putting in some work in South Carolina, trying to make a difference. Things are slow. We're in the process of trying to get transitional housing for victims of domestic violence, and we would like the public to support that. We've got to start somewhere. And the reason why I'm an advocate right now is because of Catapult Outreach, that organization. So I'm happy to say that, and I'm happy to be honored. I'm actually honored to support something like this. And as I said earlier, I thank you. You are one of the few. I guess there may be more people that are speaking out about this. I'm not sure. I haven't encountered them. I've encountered a few people, but we need more to promote change. And just as you said, I think family court needs to be abolished because there's a transfer of wealth from one group of people to another group of people. And a lot of times here in our country where power comes with money, in my opinion. And so the transfer of wealth, making people poor just because they're trying to, protect their rights, that's just out. It's unbelievable in my opinion. So I want to thank you again for joining me. Do you have anything else you would like to add?
Just to add to that, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's the tale as old as time. And thank you so much, Evelyn, for having me. I can't wait to watch this documentary. And thank you for speaking out and reaching out to me. And best of luck in anything I can do. Just let me know.
Okay, thank you. You have a great one.
You too.